Hello, everyone. This is Jeremiah Roberts, one of the co-hosts here at Cultish. I want to give you a heartfelt thanks for those of you who have generously given and supported our ministry the last few months. It's been very, very helpful. We do, however, need additional support as we head into 2025. Currently, we are operating roughly around 35 to 40% of what we need to operate on a monthly basis. So if you've been blessed by our content that we've been able to release to you, we'd ask that you would prayerfully consider partnering with us and be part of the mission to impact and change lives. Go to thecultistshow.com. There is a donate tab. You can donate one time. You can become a monthly supporter. All that goes directly towards helping us create more content. It'll allow Andrew to support his family as he is also a pastor up in Utah. And it would allow us to continue this important mission to engage the kingdom of the cults. So all that being said, enjoy this next podcast. All right, welcome back, ladies and gentlemen, to Cultish, Entering the Kingdom of the Cults. My name is Jeremiah Roberts, one of the co-hosts here. Super excited, as always, for this latest episode. I'm here with you in your super secret headquarters inside a garage that's slightly warm, although it's not Arizona warm this time of August, so I'm glad to have escaped the Arizona heat for this season. So, man, it's always good to have you back and be with you in the flesh.
It's actually, I'm having you back because you're in my garage.
Right, exactly.
So it's good to have
Strike that, reverse it.
Yeah, it's good to have you back, Jerry, and I love being with you in person doing this, man. It's always a blast.
Always. And so I'm really excited for this episode because we have had a couple recent episodes where we were kind of talking about neopaganism. Specifically, we had somebody recently, Jordan, who was a former witch, was very involved in the occult, came out of that to Christ. And just recently, we've kind of had a focus on that as of late. So I'm really excited for our guest today. We are here with Jeremy Jenkins. How are you, my friend?
Good, man. Thanks for having me.
Awesome. So real quick, tell us about who you are, and you've got a ministry. Tell us about the ministry and what's that all about.
Yeah. Well, first off, really seriously, thanks for having me. Just so you guys know, hopefully you hear it from more than just me, but it's an honor to get to hang out with you guys. I feel like Cultish and the ministry that you guys have done over the past few years has really opened up a lot of people's eyes to the reality of spiritual darkness, especially here in the United States. A lot of times, and this is really where my focus lies, a lot of people think it's an other places type problem, and it's very, very much not. And you guys have done a tremendous job bringing about a much needed awareness in the Western church towards not just apologetics, but also an evangelistic heart towards understanding people who believe different things than us. And that's really my heart. So I'm a pastor in Western North Carolina. And I'm originally from outside Chicago, but I've been pastoring at Element Church in Forest City, North Carolina for the last 14 years. And when I started down the path of pastoring, I have an undergraduate religion degree. But I joke all the time that it was really just in one religion. It was just Christianity. It was just the Bible. It was a tremendous education biblically. But as a lot of guys do, started off in ministry, bivocational, was working in the school system here in Western North Carolina, and really got to rub elbows with a young guy who was Hindu, who was a first-generation American. His family had come to the United States from India. They were very devout Hindus, and I realized that I knew nothing about Hinduism, about really other religions at all. And to keep a long story short, it really started me down a path of not only realizing, hey, for me to be able to communicate the gospel to this young man most effectively, I need to really understand his worldview, what he believes, what's different, how is he interpreting reality, and then, and you guys can probably understand this too, it started me down a path of where it was like, man, it was all I thought about was, okay, I want to learn about Hinduism. I want to learn about Buddhism, Islam, the cults, all these other things, and ended up getting a master's in intercultural studies and world religions, and then started All Things, All People, which is the ministry I founded and run. And what we do is we seek to help churches here in the United States launch intentional missional strategies to reach the unreached in their own cities and regions. And that involves a lot of worldview education, a lot of world religions type education, a lot of evangelism, apologetics, and things like that. And academically, my focus, I'm an adjunct professor at a small Christian school near me called Gardner Webb. I teach world religions basically there too. And so much of my life, the last 10 to 12 years, has been sort of tangential to the work you guys have done, which is studying what other people believe about reality and God, and then teaching Christians about that with the hope and the mission that they might be able to better communicate the gospel to those people. And so it's been a privilege, and you know, and yeah. And so been doing some work recently in neopaganism, and which has been probably the toughest thing that I've done thus far, as you guys definitely understand from the conversations you've been able to have with some of these people that you've talked to. But yeah, but it is one of the fastest growing spiritual movements here in the West, in the United States. And so that's kind of where my focus has been over the last year, is working on neopaganism and helping Christians understand what exactly it is.
Awesome, man. So, quick question: like you just said, you're a pastor, you're bivocational, and we are going to talk about a book that's in relation to our discussion. What the last 5 years, like if you just take a time capsule, like we launched at the end of 2018.
Yeah.
I could probably give you a couple of bullet points of things that I've noticed as far as just the explosion of neopaganism, right?
Oh yeah.
So one, maybe define that really quickly, what that is, and maybe can you give a couple of pinnacle examples? I feel like all of us, once you see it, you can't unsee it.
Yeah.
So like if you just circle back, take a time capsule like the last half a decade, what have you noticed culturally that's been part of the zeitgeist, the ever-growing and expanding zeitgeist of that?
Well, neopaganism is simultaneously an easy thing to define. Like if you just look at it, etymologically, like it is the current iteration of what many people sometimes genuinely, but most of the time disingenuously, regard as like a modern restoration of ancient pagan religions. But in all reality, really over the last 50 years, like you said, starting in like the 1950s, 60s, and 70s, you had figures like Gerald Gardner and Aleister Crowley in the UK really begin to bring about what we would call neopaganism. But then in the United States, I think when you think of things like what we would typically call New Age, those things became super popular in the 1960s, 70s. And starting then to now, you really have begun to see a rise in like a certain type of spiritual agnosticism, where you guys probably see the same numbers that I do out of organizations like Barna and Pew, where one of the fastest growing segments of our culture spiritually is like this group, the religious nuns, NONES, not NUNS, of course, but and in that group, these people who say I'm not religious, I'm spiritual, in that group, in my opinion, I live about an hour from Asheville, North Carolina, which is like the Portland of the Southeast. It's super hippie centric. It's super new age ish. And there's a lot of neopaganism there. If you want a snapshot of what I think we're dealing with culturally when it comes to neopaganism, is you won't meet a ton of people in your day-to-day life who say, I'm a witch, I'm a neopagan, but you'll meet a ton of people, even in our churches here in the West, who are influenced by New Age and neopagan ideas and practices and beliefs, that have led them down a path towards something that might seem as innocuous as like practicing or having some sort of belief in crystals, or burning a certain type of incense to bring about cleansing in their house, or healing, or burning a candle, things like that. And so it really, in my opinion, I don't want to seem too melodramatic. In my opinion, it's really something that if the church does not become, specifically pastors and missionaries, do not become more well-versed in, it will sneak its way into the church in these really seemingly innocent ways. And because there aren't a ton of quote unquote neo-pagans like that would say, raise their hand and say, I'm a witch, I'm a neo-pagan, I'm a druid, or something like that, amongst our younger generations, what's going to happen is that somebody might say, oh, I'm a Christian, or I like Christianity, but their heart is really wrapped up in things that are typically found in neo-paganism or New Age, or beliefs like karma, reincarnation, things like that. And so yeah, that's been my heart in the work, which is really like, you can talk about, and I'm sure we will, you can talk about Aleister Crowley and Gerald Gardner and those guys, But really what we're seeing right now in the West is a much more subversive type of New Age and neo-paganism that has kind of ridden an undercurrent in our society to where it's becoming a lot more accepted, and it's becoming a lot more difficult to identify because this is a group that mostly eschews religious labels. And so, yeah, so it's been I think anybody who looks at the shift in our society over the last, like you said, 50 years, it's impossible to ignore that as the number of um, people who identify as religious has gone down. The new atheists were wrong, in my opinion. Those people are not becoming Dawkins or Hitchens type atheists. They're becoming very spiritual people, but they're rejecting Christianity and more dogmatic iterations of religion. So I don't know if any of that makes sense. It's kind of just, where my head's been for the last couple of years, but I'm sure you guys have seen that as well.
Yeah, very much so. What are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, absolutely. So you wrote a book. Can you tell everyone where they can buy this book, what the name of the book is, and also what do you think has caused this dramatic increase in neo-paganism within the last, let's say, 15 years?
Yeah, sure. So I've been privileged to work with a woman named Felicia Masonheimer who runs a ministry called Every Woman a Theologian. And despite the fact that her ministry is very much targeted towards women, she runs this independent publisher called Verity Press. And so I published this series. We call it the Explore and Engage series. It's small little books like 20 to 30,000 words. And the first one was on the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. The second one was on neo-paganism. And I wrote the book really to be more of like a field manual type book as opposed to more of an academic volume. And people, if they want to buy it, they can go to my website, which is allthingsallpeople.org, or my ministry's website. You can go to everywomanatheologian.com and buy it. But what I think is driving that, Andrew, is like, I think at the core of a person is something that, when I was in undergraduate studies, all I ever, because I graduated high school in 2006 and I did my undergraduate studies 2006 to 2011. And all of my professors prepared me for a world that was really more driven towards, we have to have an answer for Dawkins. We have to have an answer for Hitchens. And then I graduated and I could not find one atheist. Now I'm in the Bible Belt, but it wasn't like this pure atheism. What I think is at the heart of most people is the desire to have my spiritual answers or my spiritual questions answered. And atheism does not have that, like a materialistic atheism does not have that. But we also see a rise in a people, probably starting with Gen X and millennials, and now we see it really at a large rate with Gen Z, that people do not like. People don't like dogma. People don't like being told that one group is right. And then you throw in that, at times, of course, the church in the West has done a horrible job at engaging people who have questions, right? You guys probably have heard the horror stories of people who have youth pastors or parents or pastors who make them feel like, hey, to have spiritual questions is to lack faith. And so what I think we've seen people do is reject the church and the institution of the church wholesale, but not become atheists. And they find their spiritual questions answered somewhere. And then I think what we're seeing, and I hate to trivialize it, if there's somebody listening who maybe comes from this neo-pagan background or New Age background, I don't mean to trivialize it, but this is the best way I know to explain it, is it's now sort of like the postmodern spiritual golden corral or buffet of beliefs, which is people are going to the New Age, the neo-paganism or Eastern religions, and they like karma. People love karma. Karma is such an easy belief to like until it's your karma that we're talking about. But, and they pick karma off the shelf, and they pick crystals off the shelf, and they pick, maybe some sort of like deity that seems to make sense to them. Or pantheism and panentheism, something where, man, I really value nature. And so this makes sense. And so they sort of create this pantheon of beliefs and idols that works for them. And because it works for them, you can't tell me it's not true. And I think we have a culture right now spiritually that judges what is true by what works for them. And what we fail to realize, and what I think the church has failed to communicate, is that not everything that works is good. And we look at scripture, we look at Acts, the practices of the day, the Gnostics or the Epicureans, the Stoics, the pagans, worked for them. And, people weren't shocked to see miracles. And we fail in our sort of postmodern mindset to communicate to those people, just because something works, just because something brings about maybe happiness, it is not inherently good.
Mm-hmm.
And there is a God who is personal, who loves you,
right?
But he is sovereign, and we are subject to his sovereignty. And man, that's a message that I think largely, our postmodern world and culture that largely rejects authority, man, they don't want that. And so they've turned to this more wide open, sort of catered to me spirituality. And I think that at its heart, that's sort of what's driving it.
Yeah. So I'll just say a couple of things that I've noticed, and I kind of mentioned a couple of things too when we were at a Carl Teicher one a few weeks ago. Mm-hmm. And I mentioned before is that, as far as things that I've noticed just in the last half a decade or so, and even kind of going back a little bit, is that when I first had Stephen Bancars again on the show, when I interviewed him, he kind of mentioned like ayahuasca. And I thought to myself, wait, what is that? And I just kind of smiled and nodded because I felt kind of silly to ask, like, what is that? And of course, obviously, I found later that's a hallucinogenic, that's a psychedelic that a lot of people take, and it's really popular. It's been popular for a long time in South America and primitive tribes and such. And now it's become like this normative thing. You have people like Aaron Rodgers and people like Aubrey Marcus, who's kind of been like a health guru who's really well known, and people like Megyn Kelly. Not Megyn Kelly, Machine Gun Kelly, not the person, but Megan Fox.
I was like, Megyn Kelly? He's in ayahuasca?
You never know. hopefully not. Megan Fox and Machine Gun Kelly, like they went down and did this ayahuasca ceremony where, you see this huge explosion. And just, for example, if you turn back, about a decade or so ago, a little over a decade, the highest grossing film of all time is Avatar. And like, I'm a movie nerd. I remember seeing the movie in 3D and love the special effects. Yeah. And, I saw the sequel as well, too. But the reality is that those movies, like, gross so much because for people, it literally was an escape. People got to crawl inside this avatar and go to the planet Pandora. And once you understand this worldview that you're talking about, this oneism, that all is divine, all is one, especially for sure all of you by now have seen the first Avatar film. When you see nature all become sort of one at the end and unify together, like that's the worldview that's really the spiritual zeitgeist of today's age. And so that's why those movies like gross so much. Another example too is that, we've had times where we were on Ally Beth Stuckey, we had the conversation about, whether or not you should or shouldn't celebrate Halloween. That tends to be a big time. We're coming around October. But
I dread it every year.
What I've noticed, right, and I'm kind of dread it too, like we've already stated our opinion, I'm pretty much over it, but what's very interesting, even if you're okay with like celebrating, it's going out trick-or-treating, nothing inherently sinful about that, what I've noticed is that just in the regular display cases like Target and Ross and those areas, it's not just the innocent costumes anymore. You're looking at definitively occultic material. You're looking at occultic objects. I've just seen just Ouija boards like really heavily pushed. It's like the last 5 years, I just have seen them everywhere where Halloween is promoted. And maybe it's just me. So I see that, but also, the rise in transformational festivals. I mean, you have here in Andrew here, you've got the giant Hindu temple, and there's that giant color festival. Right, we're a couple weeks away from Burning Man, which is one of the largest transformational festivals in the world. Even 6 years ago, most people wouldn't even know what Burning Man is. Even earlier, it was a couple of hippies out in the desert. Now, Burning Man is 80,000 people, and you got people who are real decision makers of our everyday well-being, different people from big tech and Google to Mark Zuckerberg to a lot of other big players and decision makers, people who are saying things who would affect our lives, and even making economic decisions. And they're adopting this worldview of oneism and neo-paganism, saying we're going to elevate this consciousness. So yeah, those are just a couple of things. I mean, we could have a podcast all day just talking about that. But what are some things that stick out to you? Is anything that I said to kind of stick out to the both of you?
Yeah, I mean, I think anybody who isn't seeing the shifts that like you just described and is either not paying attention or and unfortunately I do think a lot of Christians, like I've already mentioned, I live in North Carolina, I'm in the Bible Belt. I think a lot of Christians in the West just want to put their head in the sand and think that that's that's not as big as you think it is, or it's not as much of the culture as you think it is. But like you mentioned, when I was growing up, if a guy like Aaron Rodgers had come out and said he was using ayahuasca, like that would have stuck out and been so far fetched that, I mean, to a certain degree, he would have been like probably cut from the team or something, but it's become so normalized that people are living out such varied expressions of faith and belief and religious practice that, like I said, unfortunately, I think that any Christian who hears what we're saying and is kind of like, oh, I think these guys are being alarmist, it's just like, no, dude, you're just not paying attention, and here's the sad reality. There's a lot, like one thing I've always respected about you guys is you don't just talk about religions and cults, like you talk to people who came out of them.
Mhm.
And I think like I go to academic conferences or I speak at a conference and I'm talking about religions or something, and I will meet people who maybe are academically considered experts on a particular religion, and then I'll listen to them talk and I'll be like, bro, you have not talked to anybody from that religion in a long time. And I think, unfortunately, our world, our churches specifically are filled with people who think that they have their fingers on the pulse of the culture, but they're 20 years behind. And like I mentioned before,
Right.
and this is actually another thing that, and I'm not just trying to flatter you guys, but I think that you guys have done a great job at like not talking too much about new atheism, because like I think we can probably all agree like that's somewhat dead. Like, but
Yeah.
any pastor in the United States who thinks that's still the main problem that we need to be able to address is 25 years behind.
Yeah.
And unfortunately, man, Christians a lot of times we're just behind. And I think the value of y'all's show and hopefully the books that I'm putting out and the type of content, the work we're doing is simply just to raise awareness for church leaders and Christians that it's like, no, if you don't begin learning about this now, when your kids are grown, you will be taken aback at the problems and the questions that people have, and you won't have answers for them. And I'll be honest, I was having a conversation with a guy named Andy Bannister a few years ago. He's a tremendously gifted apologist out of the UK. And he and I were talking about kind of some of this. And then even that was in the middle when I had a conversation with him, it was in 2020, 2021, when there was so many social upheaval.
Mhm.
And he said, the biggest problem I think right now is that when Christians see that and they see these cultural changes, they get angry and they get afraid,
Right.
but they should get excited because what they see is that people are asking questions that the three of us know the gospel is the only answer for.
Mhm.
So why wouldn't we run to those people?
Yeah.
Why wouldn't we seek to place ourselves in positions in front of a neo-pagan or somebody who's bought into the new age or somebody who's bought into psychedelics to say, I can actually understand why you feel the way you do.
Mhm.
And I understand why you have these questions. And I'm not going to shut you out and pretend like your questions don't matter. Your questions matter a great deal. But the difference between you and I is that I believe the gospel is not only the best answer, it's the only answer. And what if our churches were filled with people like that?
Yeah.
And if they were, man, what kind of potential would the kingdom have for growth? And like I said, that's why I think that work like the stuff you guys are doing and so many other content creators and church leaders like you guys that are just simply bringing awareness to the church that, hey, the problems that we used to have changed and the culture has changed and society has changed. And it's leaning more in this direction of whether it's neopaganism, new age, psychedelics, it's leaning into a spiritually curious but misguided direction. And so, yeah, we want to be on the front lines of that.
Yeah, absolutely. I've been saying it for a while here on our show. I think what we're coming up against is the fruits of the bastard children of atheism, right? Fatherless children looking for reasons for why some things go bump in the night. and they turn to spiritual pragmatism is essentially what you're saying with that golden corral buffet of you pick and you choose whatever works for you. Something that I've noticed, at least with conversations on the street with individuals who are within these worldviews, is there's a fundamental misunderstanding or different philosophical approach to even history in and of itself of records of things. So when I think of neo-paganism or new paganism, I see it in such a way where there's people who are claiming things about what they believe that are historically actually inaccurate and not actually factually true. So what are some of the philosophical ways of these individuals who are neo-pagans? How do they view the world and history? Because typically their claims are always that Christianity stole from these pagan worldviews.
Yeah. Well, and you alluded to this, is that there is it's so eclectic, I guess is maybe one word. There's so much variation. If you have 10 people who maybe buy into neo-paganism, there's going to be sort of 10 different iterations of that, which in and of itself, I think is problematic. But yeah, you'll find some folks who, like I mentioned before, they really do find the validity of neo-paganism is that they trace the historicity of it back to the pre-Christian paganism of, say, Western Europe, or even, and you guys recently did some episodes on, I think it was Hermetic Mormonism. You actually have a lot of sort of those ancient Hermetic type of lineages that people try and point back to. And really it goes back to, like I've mentioned, a guy named Gerald Gardner, who in the mid 20th century began to bring out the idea that there's these pre-Christian beliefs, these pagan beliefs that never actually went away. The church just drove them underground. And then, like you said, stole some of it from it. So, we have, people every year, like you mentioned Halloween, but then my other least favorite time of the year is Christmas idolatry, because we stole that from the pagans, and that's why we have Christmas trees and all these things, and so, but the problem with that is it's actually, for the most part, been definitively shown by records and academic works that none of those claims are really true. That the neo-pagan the neo-paganism that we see today it draws its roots from these ancient pagan religions, because there's no records. There's a huge records gap that people can't account for. Now, actually, what I've seen is that a large school of thought within neo-paganism now is realizing that, and they're actually pivoting away from that, and they're really pivoting more towards that kind of postmodern, like, well, that doesn't matter. We don't need to historically validate. And they would actually, I think a lot of times would laugh at a Christian or laugh at somebody who believes that you need to have historical validity to your faith, because at its core, what neo-paganism is a worldview driven by some version of pantheism, the idea that God is all things and all things are divine. So that oneness that Jeremiah was talking about, or panentheism, the idea that God is in all things and all things are in God, but that isn't all God is. Right. And when somebody buys into that worldview, then, and everything is tied together, then the question of validity or historicity, I think, is very easy to throw out, because somebody says, well, if that's true, then, why would I need academic records? And so, which to a certain degree, if you're approaching it like an apologist as opposed to an evangelist, can be really difficult, because I find like it's trying to grab onto water. And that's actually a big problem, I think, sometimes in Christian apologetics, is that we try and checkmate somebody into faith. And with neo-paganism, that's almost impossible to do. I hate to say, I'm sure some guys can do it. I can't. And you have to realize that these people are they don't value the same things as us. We would utilize something like Gary Habermas's minimal facts argument for the resurrection. And we would say, hey, look, I can make a logical case for why I believe Christ was resurrected from the dead. And a neo-paganism would say, why would I need to make a logical case for anything? And so yeah, I think that just at the most basic epistemological level, most people within neo-paganism, and even the people who are like more soft neo-paganism, who are just influenced by it, they just don't interpret reality the same way as us. And so the argument for historicity and validity for most of them has begun to matter less, I think. And then also too, you have I was up in Asheville a couple years ago, and I detailed this conversation in the book. One thing that I think most people realize who look at it is it's impossible to miss that there is a large root of feminism in the neo-pagan movement. And so a lot of people have been driven culturally by, we don't want God to be male. We want the divine, the divine goddess. We want a more holistic, they would say, view of God. And Christianity is chauvinistic, going all the way back to the belief that God is the Father, God is man. And so yeah, it's just one of those things where if we don't realize that, like, it's like, what I would say is that, all of us have lenses on, and we're seeing the world through different lenses. And if a neo-pagan's lenses are completely shaded to see the world one way, we see the world entirely different. And then, but the message for them, it can be offensive, but it should be offensive, is, hey, I don't believe I'm wearing differently shaded lenses in the gospel. I believe I'm wearing prescriptive and corrective lenses. I believe I'm seeing the world the way it actually is, going all the way back to the way God created things. And I believe that you're seeing things through a shaded lens, through an obscured lens. And so yeah, it's difficult, and it's a difficult, like, I met you guys, we were talking about this pre-show. I met you guys in Salt Lake City a couple years ago, and we were all trying to have conversations with Latter-day Saints. There's anchor points to have a conversation with a Latter-day Saint. There's, we can look at the Articles of Faith. We can look at the Book of Mormon. We can look at the 66 canonized books that you and I would agree with, and we have anchors that we can base that conversation on. There's not as many anchors in having conversation with somebody from a neo-pagan background.
No, I appreciate that. I want to just jump into your book, maybe give people a sneak preview. So this book,
sure.
It's called Wicca and Neo-Paganism, correct?
Yes, sir.
Yes, sir. And so I really enjoyed the book, and we'll have links in our show notes. It's a really great primer, just giving people a really good overview. And there's not nearly enough books on this whole subject. I feel like it's such an under area as far as contribution goes. Right at the very beginning, the first chapter, you're talking about engaging, getting the lion's edge, and actually engaging people, be excited to go out. So I'm assuming one point where you saw this sort of new age bookstore. So rather than being scared, rather than being angry, you went in there and you talked to someone named Celeste, who is running the New Age store. What did you observe? Like, one thing I'll maybe kind of set it up for you, because he's talked about the roots of feminism in relation to that. They were kind of talking about that, but they were talking about young people want a way to understand the divine that goes beyond patriarchal Abrahamic views. That was sort of mentioned by Celeste, who's on this New Age store. And you saw a lot of sort of women coming in and out there. Tell us about that experience and what about the opening statement of the book. Maybe expand upon that.
Yeah, I think I said in the book that I was watching. So I firmly believe, now I'll say for your listeners, I have felt, going all the way back to when I was in high school. I grew up outside of Chicago, and I grew up driving around. My dad was a truck driver, and I would drive around downtown Chicago, and I would see other places of worship. And I remember, you guys will appreciate this too, because like you've had Mike Rinder on the show, who's now passed on, and the Scientology craze of like the late 90s and early 2000s. I remember seeing a Church of Scientology, and I remember thinking, I want to go in there and see what that's like, and but I felt always like, oh, Christians aren't allowed to do that, and then I started, when I got into ministry life, I started to really think, well, no, I think somebody needs to go in there. Like, I think a Christian does need to go in there. And so just so your listeners know, because they don't know me that well, is from time to time we will go to places like a New Age or a neo-pagan shop. We will go to Hindu temples. We do those things prayerfully. We do those things as a team. We do those things with a team holding us accountable to make sure we're not being stupid or foolish or reckless, But so that's what we were doing. Like I mentioned, we live near Asheville, and Asheville is just like this weird center of neo-paganism and New Age and feminism and liberalness. And so we went into this place, and it turns out that it's like the most important neo-pagan shop probably in the Southeast, and that's Celeste, who that's not her actual name, but it's pretty close, I think so. But I come to find out through talking to her that like she's a really important neo-pagan figure in my area. And I said in the book that watching young women walk in the door and they were going to her the same way that people walk up to me on a Sunday after I preach and they ask for advice and they say, I have this problem and I just need some wisdom. And, but what her answer was she would walk them to maybe a bundle of pre-made, incense and herbs. So I remember one woman saying, there's a lot of negativity in my house and I don't know what to do. And she was like, oh, come over here. There's this sage bundle that you need to burn, and, and it was like every person who came in would go to her almost like a doctor or a pastor. And they would say, I have this problem. And her answer was some ritualistic charm or practice. They had a tarot card reader in the back behind a closed door who was doing tarot card readings. And I was just sitting there and I was looking around and I was like, oh, so in some ways, these people are no different than the people at my church who they have problems and they want spiritual answers. But the difference is that, and I don't just mean to make it out to be like I'm better than her, but is that I go, when people come to me on a Sunday with those problems, I say, hey, let's go to the Lord. Let's pray for his intercession. Let's pray for his intervention. And she was taking them to bundles of sage and candles and signing them up for tarot card readings and all of these things. And so it was quite startling in all honesty. And I've actually, over the years of having trips like that, I've gotten to the point where like when I smell sage, I almost have I almost like get sick because I've smelt sage so many times in temples and in witchcraft places that it's like, it creates an aversion for me. And so that was what was happening. And it was quite pragmatic. Like Andrew said, it's a spiritual pragmatism at its core. But at the same time, it was deeply, deeply spiritual. Yeah. And so it was an eye-opening experience for me to take it more seriously.
And also another question I had that stuck out to me when we talk about defining terms, right? We made a distinction between, because people here have heard the name, the New Age, right?
Yeah.
And I feel like that was almost like was a title sort of given by Walter Martin in around the 70s when he started really seeing that here in the West. But there's a distinction between the New Age and Neo-Paganism between your book. Both of them have a worldview of one, all is self, but they're slightly distinct from each other. Can you expand upon that or maybe clarify for our audience?
Sure, yeah.
How it differs from the New Age?
Yeah, like you mentioned, the book is a primer. It's not an academic. Like if somebody was wanting a super thorough understanding, like this is not the book for them. This is more for people who are just really wanting to learn how to have conversations with people from these backgrounds. But so the way I kind of distinguish between the two is, New Age at its core, I guess, if it has a core, because it's so varied across the practices, is it's usually very impersonal. There's not usually a belief in any sort of deity or manipulation necessarily of a deity or the spiritual realm, so to speak, as much as it's more, you find things like crystals, you find things like incense burning, things like that. But it's not usually an open appeal to the spiritual realm as much as neo-paganism is. And what I tell people though is that doesn't mean that New Age, what you would typically classify as New Age, is less harmful. And I actually say in the book, and my editor and I really wrestled with whether or not we wanted to make this claim because it's not provable. But I truly believe that the New Age is really a gateway drug for neo-paganism. Is that if a young person really if they really begin to find spiritual answers in what we would typically call New Age, I think that person is dangerously close to one day living out a life of seeking to manipulate the spiritual or a deity, which you and I would probably say is really just the demonic, is opening themselves up in a very personal way through ritual, through group practices that is much more of a religion than what we would typically see in the New Age. I think the two are really tied to each other. But one in the case of the New Age seems a lot more trivial and innocent, but it really is not.
Would this be fair to say that it appears that the New Age draws heavily more from Hinduism in Eastern philosophy versus neo-paganism as drawing from, let's say, like ancient Babylonian occult religions in which you use objects for specific rites and rituals in order to gain some form of contact of an entity or quote unquote what they would say is God, versus, again, the New Age being more Indian, as in India, Hinduism and stuff like that.
Yeah, I think that's why you're the sleuth, man. I think that's a pretty great point. Like, is a good distinction. Of course, somebody who's listening who's really well versed in those things would say, well, no, that's not exactly true. But we're dealing with like non-absolutes when we're talking about these things.
Yeah.
And so I think that you're right, because anybody who's familiar with Buddhism or Hinduism or what we would typically call, Eastern faiths, there is a lot of spiritual practice that is non-personal, in the sense that drawing a mandala on the street corner in the morning, which you would see a lot in India, is not directly tied necessarily to a particular deity, but it's believed to have some spiritual power. This almost inanimate practice will bring about some sort of spiritual power or change for me. Whereas what you would typically see in neo-paganism is some form of idol worship or some form of belief. And in the book, I detail the difference between like a mechanical system and an organic system. And what we would see in neo-paganism is a mechanical system. If I perform X practice, then Y will happen, and so they believe if I burn this incense, if I burn this candle, if I perform this sacrifice amongst a coven, then Y will happen. Whereas in an organic system, which is what Christianity is the idea that, hey, I will pray, I will fast. Some Christian traditions anoint things with oil, but it's not those things themselves that have power. It's God who has power, and I'm appealing to him, and he is ultimately sovereign and judge over what will and what will happen. Right. And once again, hearkening back to the beginning of this conversation, I think that's a big reason why neo-paganism is so attractive to so many people, is because they want power. And actually, Celeste said that. I can't remember if I mentioned this in the book, but I asked her, I said, why do you think it's gotten so much more popular? And her simple answer, and I completely agreed with her, was, I think people are just trying to gain more control over their lives. And I that was one of the few things she and I agreed on that day.
Yeah.
Because I definitely think that's what is at the heart of a lot of this growth, is people want control. And where you're never going to get control over your life is worshiping a God who's king. And so I think that's been a big reason for it.
Yeah. One of the things that stuck out to me in your book is in the distinction that you made, and again, really appreciate everything you said, is just how the New Age is more of an impersonal consciousness. But then usually the neo-paganism, where it's more a more specified deity, where you see that within Avatar, like the film, where you're seeing it's actually a worship of the divine feminine. And what's interesting, though, when you talk about it being more focused on the old god, the worship of the old gods, like even in film and television now, you're seeing that. Like there's a couple years ago, there's a film, The Northman, that came out, like really intense. It's almost like the Saving Private Ryan of Vikings movies, but it's a dark movie. And in it, like you see people, I knew a bunch of people who were really this is such an awesome, cool, gnarly, manly movie, but every character in there, they're linked to the old gods. Like they're really tapped into these deities. And it's almost like these eras prior to these places being Christianized, like somehow this was a really nice and wonderful place, and it was horrible. Like you have people just killing each other, like burning men, women, and children, like in buildings. And there's a most recent show I watched the first episode on called Chief of War. It's with Jason Momoa, but it's all about the different tribes in the Hawaiian Islands. Yeah. And basically, when you watch it, all of them are tied into worshiping the mana, worshiping these specific deities in the high places, and that is completely influential on all the decision making and even human sacrifice and killing each other. And I remember like watching the first episode, like from production standpoint, it was really well done, the Chief of War show on Apple TV. But I was watching it, and I'm like, man, this is just so bizarre that we're watching this show that they put millions of dollars into to make it really well done, almost like glorify this period in time where people just killed each other by the masses and had no respect or saw each other as having dignity, value, or worth, and because they were into these deities, which were actually glorifying. It almost seemed to be almost like a contradiction in terms, because everyone in that show who produced it, they would assume personal dignity and worth. They actually saw that happening in real life, what they're emulating in film. They would cry out injustice. Yeah. But we're going to make a film, though, where we can escape. And this is actually a really good thing, a really enjoyable thing you can watch in Apple TV, at least the first 3 episodes.
Yeah. And there's been a rise, too. Like, you mentioned, I don't think it's coincidental that we're seeing more of that kind of stuff in our media. And there's actually been quite a rise in belief in things like Odinism or like Norse mythology, which is part of neopaganism. And that, once again, is just an example of like the huge variance that you'd see. And it's very difficult when you say, oh, that person's neopagan. That really doesn't describe what they believe, because there's so much differentiation between that. But I have a friend who's a chaplain in the Army, a Christian chaplain. And he tells me, he's like, man, you would be so taken back by the number of young men who have begun to practice as much as you can, but really find truth in that old Norse mythology of Odinism. And I think, once again, we can draw a line back to that of like, okay, these are young guys who maybe grew up in a really Christian culture. What is appealing to them about that? It can't just be that they watched Thor Ragnarok and they thought that looks pretty cool. It's like, that's once again, over trivializing it. What are they finding in that they seemingly are not finding in Christianity or any other religion? And, that's a deep well. And that's why also in the book, I really make a point of saying like, hey, don't just read books on neopaganism and then think neopaganism. The beauty of becoming more well-versed in this is like the freedom that you have to be able to say, okay, I know enough now to really go and ask this person who's in front of me, why do you believe that? And I think if Christians, as opposed to just maybe listening to your podcast or reading my book and then just quietly putting it back on the shelf and never really doing anything with it, if every listener of this show went to the one person, probably more than one really, who's in their life who has been influenced by New Age or maybe is openly practicing some form of neopaganism, if all you did was just go up to them and say, why do you believe that? You would learn so much about that person's worldview and the motivations. And going back to that Andy Bannister notion of, man, we should get excited when someone reveals those things to us, because then we can say, let me tell you what I've had some version of those same insecurities. I've had some version of those same questions. But what I came to the conclusion is that the truth of Jesus and his life and his death and his resurrection, his ascension, is a much, much better and holier answer than what you're going to see out of Norse mythology, where, like you just said, those gods are just worse versions of us. I mean, they're like, if we met those gods and we met the Greek gods and we met the pagan gods, we'd be like, these are horrible people. Why would I worship them? But yet we see the rise of it now because people are finding something lacking, I suppose, in the message of the gospel.
What do you think, if you could just try to think off the top of your head, what do you think these people think is missing from Christianity? Let's use Odinism or Asatru, for example. What do you think they would respond with?
Well, I think that in specifically, we'll go back to, just for a moment, the rise of feminism and the rise of the divine goddess worship, which is really probably the most popular thing that we're going to see. Is it goes back to what Celeste said in that shop, is people want something different than what they get in day-to-day life. And there's this misconception that, this is a patriarchal society where, women are horribly oppressed. And so I think that they see in the church a male-dominated world where women are made to feel inferior, women are oppressed, and and you know, it'd be foolish for us three to say that there's no Christian iterations that look like that, and we should probably be louder in calling those people out when we see that. But in turn, what they found is in neopaganism and divine goddess worship is they see, oh, there's more room for me here as a woman or as a feminist, um, and they don't feel like God is unlike them. And I think at the end of the day, like when we switch back to Norse mythology and we go, how could anybody believe that? Is I think that there's a lot to be said for it being attractive for people to see something in God that is like them. This God is not completely unlike me. Whereas you and I would say, I take great comfort in the fact that God is not like me. You know, if God was like me, he wouldn't be worthy of worship. I want the God who is Karl Barth's holy other. He is so intrinsically different than me. And the only thing that's similar is that, you know, he said he made me in his image. And there's something about me, the most important part of me is that when he looks at me, I remind him of him somehow, but everything else is diametrically opposed, right?
Yeah.
And so I think that people see a high level of pragmatism, right? I can do things and it works and it changes my life, it changes my world, it changes my circumstances, supposedly. They see a high level of control, and then they see in maybe the Norse pantheon or the divine goddess, they see a God that looks more like them, that is more relatable, and that once again gives them more of a grip on their life, they feel. Whereas what Christianity says is give your life to God. You know, he who does not pick up his cross and follow me is not, you know, with me. To live, you must die. And I think, man, we have such a skewed view of self in our world. And Andrew, this goes back to what you were drawing the lines to the Eastern mysticism, is that our view of who and what we are is going to affect what we worship. And if I believe that myself is the most important thing, then all of my beliefs are going to follow that pattern. But if I believe that God is the truest and most beautiful and most holy thing, and I want to follow him, then I'm going to knock over any idol that a human has created. And so yeah, I think it's that going back to that control, it's going to a relatability, a pragmatism that people think is lacking in Christianity. And in some ways it is, because you know, to truly follow Christ is to say, I'm not always going to get my way. That problem might not get fixed, but that is dying to self. And so I think at its core, it's a misevaluation of the value and role of self. I think it was Carl Trueman wrote the book on self a few years ago. I think every Christian should read. I think that and I've seen you guys put out a lot of content talking about that self-centeredness of the New Age and the neo-paganism, and then also all of these former neo-pagans like that you guys have interviewed and I see creating content. It seems like that's really what they're saying is, hey, at its center, it is a very high valuation of self and my desires.
Yeah.
And then Christianity rejects that. You know, I mean, it's not that God doesn't care about us, and it's not that we shouldn't care about ourselves, but it's I care about something else much more, and that is following Christ wherever he calls me.
Yeah, I mean, like the reality of humanity is that apart from God and his revelation, we are so fallen that we cannot actually truly know what it means to be human apart from God's saving grace. So
yeah, I
believe that apart from God's grace, no one knows the self. They are self-ish. Our podcast is cult-ish, right? Like,
right. Yeah.
Through God and his grace alone, by his mercy, I know what it means to be truly human. But people
correct
that are within neo-paganism is they're looking for that self, and it becomes all about themselves, and it's innately selfish as much as they would like to put out into the universe a holistic care for the world and everything. The fruits of neo-paganism is essentially child sacrifice. thinking eschatologically, for me at least, in Colossians chapter 1, I believe it says Christ disarmed all rulers, principalities, and powers, put them to open shame through triumph over them in him, referring to the demonic. So how would you try to extrapolate, at least for our listeners here, what exactly is happening in the waterless places when these neo-pagan practices occur? Is it like there's some type of thing that's occurring that lights up the waterless place that gives the demon attraction to this person? And how do they actually have influence in a world in which Jesus Christ has conquered them?
Man, that's such a good question. And I wrestle with that a lot in the book. And I'm so glad that you referenced Colossians 1, and I would extend that to Colossians 2 as well. It's such an important section of scripture where Paul saw fit to write to the church at Colossae saying, hey, why would you allow? So think about this. Paul wrote this 2,000 years ago. There's nothing new about neopaganism. I mean, this is the same. It's the same problems that humanity has always had. And I actually call, I think I mentioned it in the book, but it's the most ancient lie ever told, right? It's that the serpent in the garden looked at Eve and said, God doesn't want you to eat the fruit because if you do, you'll become just like him. And so Paul saw fit to write at the church at Colossae as saying Christ has put these elemental spirits, the demonic, to open shame and proclaims over them his victory of the cross and resurrection. So in turn, Paul questions, so why would you allow yourselves to be made subject to someone who holds you to days on a calendar or phases of the moon and stars? That's the same thing that's happening in neo-paganism right now. And I hate to sound, once again, alarmist, but even something as foolish and stupid as zodiac signs, we see a huge rise in that again. Whereas when I was a kid, your zodiac was like in the newspaper and, it's like, oh, I'm a Gemini. This is my little fortune cookie for the day. But you guys probably see it even more than I do, which is people are genuinely in bondage to the idea that, oh, because I was born under this star, I'm this type of person. And so what I would tell people, and this is where, depending on the tradition that somebody comes from in Christianity, they might struggle with this, but I feel very confident that biblically I can back this up, is that there is an unseen spiritual component to reality. Unfortunately, because the church in the West is just as influenced by the post-Enlightenment materialist mindset as non-believers are, too many Christians have sort of begun to equate something being spiritual with something being less real.
Yep.
And so they don't, when they think about the demonic or they think about the angelic, they sort of treat it like they do Aesop's fables or Paul Bunyan. Is they're like, what truth can I extrapolate from that? Whereas what I would say is, man, no, that's really real, and that's happening now. And when we look at the book of Daniel and we see Daniel refusing to bow down to the idols that the king, had put forth, and he prays and fasts for 40 days, we see an angel show up who says, hey, I'm sorry for the delay, but there is a war in the heavenly places. And it almost seems like Daniel's prayers and fasting fueled that war, on the angelic side. So what I would say to somebody who is either curious about this or maybe is coming out of neo-paganism is I would say that I believe that there is an enemy of God. He is not on equal footing with God. This is not dualism. This is not yin and yang. There's an enemy of God, and he has spiritual beings who, like him, have rebelled against Yahweh, and they are seeking to steal, kill, and destroy from Yahweh's people. And Mike Winger, who I know you guys know, I don't know him, but I've leaned heavily on his scholarship. I've heard him when he's talking about Satan saying that it's like the guy pushed into the pool whose last hope is to just bring somebody into the pool with him.
Yeah.
So what I believe is that neo-pagans and people who've bought into really any faith that's counter to Christianity, the religion of Yahweh, but more so neo-paganism, just because it's such an open appeal to the spiritual realm, what they are doing is actually you have no power over the demonic. They are merely giving you what you want, because what you want is bringing you deeper into rebellion and bringing you deeper into a naive joining in with their ranks of rebelling against the God of all gods, who's Yahweh. And so I think that what I would say is, hey, those things might work, and that's where I think some Christians begin to tune me out, which is I would say, hey, I don't think Paul would have written so polemically against paganism if from time to time something that a pagan didn't work. Because behind those pagan rituals, behind that idol worship, is the demonic who, man, so you're telling me that all they have to do to get you to dive deeper into rebellion against Yahweh, against the crucifixion and resurrection of Christ, is to just give you what you want every once in a while? That's exactly what they'll do. And C.S. Lewis said that in Screwtape Letters that, there's two equal mistakes that Christians make. It's becoming too infatuated with the demonic and the spiritual realm, which is certainly a caution that I have for people, but also trivializing it. And I think our culture largely trivializes the spiritual too much. And like I said earlier, equates something that is spiritual with something that is less real. And I say, that the spiritual is just as real as the physical. It just can't be seen, taste, touch, smelled, or tested. And so this is somewhat divisive. I would, if somebody had questions on that, I would point them to the works of Mike Heiser, Unseen Realm, Demons, Angels. Some people struggle with like his hermeneutic, which I can understand, but I do think largely he does a good job opening people up to the reality of what the Bible says about the spiritual realm. People might struggle with the divine counsel mindset, but I don't think it's necessary to believe in the divine counsel to understand that he was largely right about the spiritual realm and what the Bible has to say about it. So that's what I would say. It's not, and I hate to use a double negative, but I was in India one time, and I walked out of my hotel room and I saw somebody lighting incense to a Hindu deity. And my first thought was, that's not going nowhere. That's not doing nothing. You know what I mean? And I wholeheartedly believe that there is a spiritual realm filled with these demonic forces that are seeking to drag us down with them, and people who are entertaining them through neo-pagan ritual are opening themselves up to that demonic realm in a way which every once in a while they might get what they want, but one day they'll look around and realize that they have led themselves to a very, very dark and lonely place.
Awesome. Well, that's such a great way to wrap up. I mean, when there's so much more I want to unpack in part two. Anders, anything last you want to add up as we wrap up here?
No, praise God, brother. I think that is a great way to wrap up the first episode. I'm excited to get back into the second one right away.
Yeah, absolutely. So we're going to jump back into tapping into the supernatural and unseen realm and the giant broad canvas of neo-paganism. So we look forward to talking with you more in part two of this conversation. Real quick, as we wrap up here, tell everyone where we'll have links in our show notes. Where is home base for you? Where can people get the book? Where can people find out more about you?
Yeah. Website is allthingsallpeople.org. Instagram is at allthings.allpeople. I say most of my content's probably on Instagram. I'm not a TikTok guy or anything else. And so, and then they can get the book on the website. And and I appreciate you guys so much for just giving this little bit of time here to have this conversation.
Awesome. Well, if you guys enjoyed this episode, definitely comment and let us know what you thought. And as always, a program like this cannot continue without your support. So please consider partnering with us to help our ministry to continue and get these conversations out to those who need to hear it. You can go to thecultistshow.com. There's a donate tab. You can go to one time or monthly and be a partner with us. Be part of the mission to change lives and get the gospel proclamation out there. All that being said, we'll talk to you all next week on Cultish. Talk to you all soon.